Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of On Attachment. Today's episode is a really special one, and I apologize in advance for this very scrappy, if you're watching the video of this very scrappy video recording. I am in a hotel room in Belgium, and I had to put out a podcast episode today, and I was thinking about what to do, and I decided to share with you a video that I recorded a little while ago on my journey, my story with anxious attachment. What my life looked like when I was really in the depths of my anxious attachment and how I dug myself out of that hole, how I walked away from a relationship that was really unhealthy, and how I ultimately built self worth and built the life that I have now, which looks very different to the life that I had then. This is a video that you may have watched if you have downloaded my Anxious Attachment Starter Kit, which is a free resource that I offer. But for most of you that haven't, I really hope that what I share in today's episode in this video gives you some hope and optimism that, you might look at me now and think that I'm very far away from where you might feel. And you can rest assured that I know exactly what it feels like and I remember it well to stand where you stand. And so I'm hoping that in sharing my story, you can see that we're not all that different and that there is hope, no matter how hopeless it can feel when you're in the thick of it. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to remind you about my Black Friday sale. My Black Friday offers this year are by far the steepest discounts that I've ever offered on my programs. I'm offering two bundles, one for breakups, one for relationships. So in both bundles, you get Healing Anxious Attachment, which is my signature course, over 3,000 past students. And then depending on where you're at, if you've been through a breakup, the breakup bundle, you also get Higher Love, which is my best-selling breakup course. Or if you're in a relationship or dating, the Secure Relationship Bundle, you get my Secure Together course for couples and navigating anxious avoidant dynamics that I recorded with my partner Joel. And with both bundles, you get my entire masterclass library. So every masterclass workshop I've ever taught included free, and none of those are available for individual sale anymore. So this is the only way to get them. And on top of that, you also get an invite to a live Q&A with me. So it really is an exceptional deal, and it's at a very heavy discount. There's also a payment plan available. I've really tried to make it as accessible as possible for you. So if that is of interest to you, definitely check it out. The sale is only live for a few more days. And I would really love to welcome you in if you are wanting to do this work and really commit to yourself. And I should say, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, because I know it's a pretty busy time of year, you get lifetime access to everything. So it's not like you have to sit down and dig into all of this work straight away. You could start it in January if you wanted to, or just chip away at it at a pace that works for you. So don't feel like it's adding stress or adding things to your plate at a busy time of year, because I know that that can be a factor as well. Okay, I really hope that you enjoy hearing about my story in today's episode, and I'm sending you all so much love. Hey, everybody. In this video, I am going to be sharing all about how I healed my anxious attachment, which is something that I've touched upon in podcast episodes over the past couple of years, but something that I've never really shared in this kind of format. So it's a bit of a vulnerable one for me. And I really hope that it is not only helpful, but a source of inspiration for you. Because if there's anything that I've learned in my own journey and in guiding thousands of other people through the journey of healing anxious attachment, it's that healing is absolutely possible, that anxious attachment is not a life sentence. As much as it can feel overwhelming and unfair and so challenging, it is a learned way of being. And that means that we are able to learn another way of being, a way that is more secure, that allows us to feel safe within ourselves and trusting of others in relationships, where we don't have to be on such high alert all the time, where we don't have to worry whether someone loves us, whether they care, whether they're going to be there for us, when we don't have to work so hard to get other people's attention and affection and approval and keep it, where we can actually rest in our relationships in the knowing that we are loved and valued and cared for. And it frees up so much energy to focus on other things in life, on joy and things that you're passionate about and other relationships. So much becomes possible when you commit yourself to this healing work. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you in this video how I went about that and how you can too. So you might look at me today and wonder whether I really understand what it's like to have anxious attachment. And I can understand that because, frankly, my life today looks very different to what it did not that long ago in the scheme of things. But if we were to rewind to my early to mid 20s to paint the picture for you of what I was like, what my life was like, what my relationships were like, and how anxious attachment was a common thread through all of that, which was making things pretty challenging for me. So I used to be a corporate lawyer. So I was working in a corporate law firm, working very long hours. I was in a relationship which was, in hindsight, such a mess. But at the time, I was so swept up in it all, in the drama of it. I had incredibly low self worth. I really didn't like myself very much. But on the outside, you may not have necessarily perceived that because I was ticking all the boxes. I'd always been a high achiever. Things had always worked out pretty well for me on the surface. But deep down, I felt very empty. I didn't respect myself. And the life choices that I was making were incongruent with my values. I think I really didn't have much of a sense of what my values were. And so I cut corners. I showed up in whatever mask I needed to wear to get the approval and to fit in with people who, frankly, I didn't even like or respect that much, to fit in environments that I thought were bullshit, if I'm being really candid with you. But that was just what I did because that was what I felt like I needed to do to almost feel or overcome the deficit of self-worth that I felt deep inside. And on the relationship front, well, my first couple of relationships, I was quite lucky, were with secure partners. So from my teenage years and then my very early 20s, I was into mostly healthy relationships with secure partners. And so my anxious attachment didn't really come to the fore until my mid 20s when I entered a very dysfunctional relationship. And this was my first experience with a very avoidant partner. And because I had mostly secure partners prior to that, his behavior was so confusing to me and it really reeled me in. And that combined with my low self-worth meant that rather than just looking at his behavior and seeing it for what it was, being that he didn't treat me very nicely and he was confusing and dismissive and disrespectful, rather than seeing that for what it was and saying, okay, I'm not interested in this person, something within me lit up and took on the challenge and saw that as an opportunity to transform him, to change him, to win over his approval and affection. And it was almost like on a subconscious level, if I could get this person to change, this person whose behavior was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before in relationships, if I could get him over the line, then it was almost like I'd win the prize. And that would prove to me and to everyone else that I was really special. Because if I could change him, if I could be the reason for his metamorphosis, then that must mean something about how valuable and worthy I am. So it was this weird combination of really low self-worth together with, I think, some ego stuff on top that drove me into this dynamic and kept me there in the face of behavior that drove me absolutely nuts and left me feeling so confused, so disrespected, so dismissed all the time. And in saying all of that, you might think that, oh, this was just like a little fling of a relationship and then I saw the light. Well, I wish that were true, but after the first kind of 9 months, which were completely insane. If I were to go through all of the gory details of it, you probably wouldn't believe me. So much drama, so much outright dishonesty, so many breaches of trust. And yet, from that point, from when I knew all of that, I pushed forward. I almost thought, well, we've got it all out in the open now, and I don't want to give up. That whole sunk cost mentality of, well, we've been through all of this. Why give up now? And so from that point, I proceeded and continued to be in that relationship for another 3 years from that point. So just to contextualize how deep I was in this mission of trying to get this person to change and this intense savior complex that I had had where I just couldn't give up. I couldn't see the situation for what it was. I couldn't reconcile the fact that I had completely abandoned myself in an effort to change this person and to get them to treat me well. So I just had to keep pushing, because at least if I could get him to change, then it wouldn't have all been a waste. It wouldn't be so humiliating that I had let all of that happen, because the story would have a happy ending. So that's the backdrop, right? That's where I was in my anxious attachment. And as I said, his behavior would drive me crazy every day. We, eventually moved in together and lived together for 2 years. And he worked in a very demanding job and was very much focused on work. So I always felt like I was competing with his work and coming up second best, or frankly, further down the list after all of the other things that he would prioritize above me. I would call him to see what time he was coming home from work, and he would ignore my calls, and I'd text and he'd read my texts and not respond, and I'd send a million of them. Just this incredibly high stress activated state that I was in, so worked up and so infuriated that someone would just blatantly ignore me, asking a simple question like, "Are you going to be home for dinner tonight?" All of these things that really, again, I was so deep in it that I was unable to see it for what it was. And I was unable to just say, clearly, this isn't a good fit. Clearly, this is not a satisfactory relationship. Clearly, this is not working. In my mind at the time, the only thing I could do was tell him over and over again how much he was hurting me, and how could he do that, and how could he not see that any normal person would behave like XYZ. It's like I had to get him to see things from my point of view, so that he would change, so that I wouldn't have to feel the discomfort and the stress and the anxiety that I constantly felt. So that's the backdrop, right? That's where things were at. Now, thankfully, I saw the light at some point, and I think gradually over time, I became less and less invested in trying to get him to change. And I think I started to see things for what they were. And frankly, I think I lost respect for him along the way, and I maybe stopped putting him on this pedestal of needing to get him to choose me, and started to realize that, this was just not going to work. And I started to get this sense that maybe there was something wrong with the situation rather than just something wrong with me. That tends to be a really common thing that anxiously attached people do, is rather than there being something wrong with the situation, there must be something wrong with me. If this person can't meet my needs, I'll just try not to have them. Or if this person isn't respecting my boundaries, I guess my boundaries are wrong, rather than maybe something's not right with the situation. So I think a part of me started to clock onto this, to go, there's probably something that's not quite right with this situation. And a really big step in my journey was that I started going to therapy for the first time in my life. I was always someone who thought that I was mostly okay and I had everything together and I was pretty well resourced, but it was becoming clear to me that was maybe not true, and that there was more going on under the surface in me that needed my attention. So thankfully, I plucked up the courage to go to therapy, and I found an amazing therapist who was really instrumental in my journey. And she gifted me so many things that were ultimately key pieces in the puzzle for me in becoming more secure, in stepping away from that relationship and stepping towards the life that I have now, and really trusting in myself to be able to build all of that, and trusting in my capacity to want more, and trusting that I was deserving of more. So I'm going to walk you through now 6 of the changes that I made that ultimately allowed me to heal my anxious attachment and build the life that I have now, which is so far beyond what I ever could have dreamed of back then when I was in the dumpster fire of my previous relationship and all of the stress that brought me. To picture my life now, it would have been like a dream. So I'm going to walk you through all of that. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not some exception to the rule. If it's possible for me, it is possible for you. It's not easy. It's not overnight. It takes courage and it takes commitment. But if you can relate to anything that I was just saying about some of those relationship patterns that come along with anxious attachment, then listen up, because this is the roadmap that you need. This is what you need to focus on if you want to also build up your sense of self-worth and start to build the life and relationships that you want. Okay, so the first thing that I did was I had to look really honestly at my relationship patterns and my role in them. So when I was in that dysfunctional relationship, it was so easy for me to look at everything that was going on. And I deeply believed that he was the problem and that everything that he was doing was the reason for all of our troubles. He was the one who was lying all the time. He was the one who was unreliable and inconsistent and unpredictable and moody and erratic and all of these things. In my mind, I was the perfect partner. I was like stable and lovely and reliable and all of those things. I was bending over backwards all the time to try and smooth out our life, to make everything function well and to make everything work. And he was like this tornado of volatility. And in my mind, it was like, if you just don't do all of those things that you always do, then everything will be fine. And that was really the story that felt very true to me, that I had no role in the dysfunction, that my behavior, to the extent that it was anything other than perfect, was in response to his behavior. And so if his behavior stopped, then so too would mine and everything would be good. And as it happens, that wasn't quite true. The more that I learned about attachment, the more I realized that, okay, there's maybe a little more to this, and that my behaviors, which I perceived as being a perfectly reasonable response to his behaviors, there was a reason that I behaved the way that I did and responded the way that I responded that kept the system intact, kept the cycles going. A secure person would not have been in the situation that I was in. And I had to really reckon with the fact that something within me got me there and kept me there. And that was my responsibility. That was my work. And even the part of me that believed that I just had to change him in order to create safety for me, that was one of my pieces of work to do, right? Because again, a secure person doesn't tend to think and operate in that way. A secure person would say, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not available for this kind of behavior. This is so clearly dysfunctional, right? So I really had to own that some of my stuff was showing up here, things that had maybe been latent within me in my previous relationships where they weren't so triggered, where I wasn't brought into contact with them in quite the same way. This person who I was in a relationship with, it's like it woke up these parts of me that were already there, that like the architecture had already been built for all of those things from earlier in my life. And that was another piece of the work, is really connecting the dots and understanding where this came from within me, looking really honestly at my family system and how my childhood environment had shaped me in that way and primed me for that kind of relationship and that kind of dynamic of suppressing my own needs and being the savior and trying to make people show up in a particular way, believing that my safety came from controlling the people around me and the environment around me. All of that stuff was mine and originated with me. Now, that's not to excuse his shitty behavior. That was still there and that was still a big piece of it. But I really had to own how I got to be there and what had kept me there for so long. So looking really honestly at all of that, which was something my therapist was able to help me shine a light on, that was really instrumental in me feeling like I had more responsibility and more agency over the situation. Because before I was able to see that, I felt very powerless and incredibly frustrated because I was convinced that he held the keys to my happiness and he was withholding that. And that was selfish and unfair and unkind. And so I just kept in this cycle of blaming him and feeling like a victim. So when I was able to see things a little more clearly, I was able to also see my part in it and start to own where my work was in shifting those patterns. And that was really empowering because it allowed me to actually take things back into my own hands. Okay, the next key piece was that I focused on building my self-worth. So this was big and it was a process. But as I said, I had really low self-worth. I didn't like myself very much. Never mind the self-love stuff. I didn't even like myself. I was highly self-critical, but also highly critical and judgmental of others. Again, it was this kind of ego thing sitting on top of really low self-worth. And so I had to get honest about behaviors that I was engaging in, people that I would be around, environments that I'd participate in that really reliably led to me feeling bad about myself and not liking myself. And I had to clean up my act. I used to go out drinking all the time, and then I'd behave in ways that the next morning I'd feel so humiliated and embarrassed and uncomfortable about how I'd been, so much anxiety, all of that sort of stuff. I had to really audit, like, where am I engaging in behavior that reliably leaves me feeling bad about myself? And where do I need to bring my values and my choices into alignment so that I can actually just say, I'm comfortable with who I am and how I'm showing up. And that was really important. Another key piece of building self worth for me was working on my self respect, which part of that was the values work, but it was also self discipline and really changing the stories I had about the type of person that I was and what was possible for me. So I've told the story before of a little challenge that I set for myself as I was nearing the end of that relationship. It was almost like it was preparing me to pull the trigger and walk away. And I set myself the challenge to run 100 kilometers over the course of a month, which, is no great feat for people who are runners, but I was not a runner. At least I never thought of myself in that way. It wasn't something that I regularly did. And so it was a very lofty goal for me at the time. And I set that goal and I did it, and I kept showing up, and it was really hard, and I did it, and I showed up again and again, and it got easier, go figure. And doing something like that was actually really formative for me in, serving as a physical embodiment, a physical reminder of pushing my comfort zone and the fact that it's okay to be uncomfortable and that that is part of growth, and showing myself in real time that I can be the type of person that I've always said I'm not that type of person and that's not possible for me. And so having that as a really embodied reminder of growth happening on the other side of our comfort zone sounds corny, but it's very true. And starting to push the edges of that for me and build my capacity to be more than I had ever really allowed myself to be, and dismantling all of those limiting beliefs and stories that I had held and that had shaped me and kept a lid on who I was up until that point. So really working on building my sense of self, working on liking myself more. A really big piece of that puzzle, which I haven't really touched on, is that I ultimately quit my job as a lawyer, obviously doing this now, because for me, that was another piece that was just not in alignment. And I knew deep down, this cannot be my life, sitting in a cubicle till the early hours of the morning every day, doing work that at times it was exciting, but it didn't mean anything to me. I didn't believe in it. And the idea that I was going to spend the next few decades of my life in that, most of my waking hours until I'm at retirement age, it felt so existentially overwhelming and soul destroying that I had to really own that. And looking around me, I didn't want the life of the people that were 5 or 10 years ahead of me in their careers. And so I really had to reckon with the fact that I was walking, with my eyes open into a life that I didn't want, and that actually felt quite suffocating and stifling to me and who I was at a core level. So I made the decision that I wasn't going to do it. And I started researching what alternatives might look like and pathways to doing that. And I had always been so passionate about relationships and psychology and this kind of work. And so I got to researching on how I might go about making a career change. And long story short, I pulled the trigger and I did that without much of a plan, to be frank. But I had developed enough self-trust by that point that I believed that I would figure it out. And here we are, rest is history. So that was another key piece of the puzzle for me, which I put under the umbrella of cleaning up parts of my life where I was out of integrity and where the vision that I had for myself and the yearnings that I had deep inside were really at odds with the way that I was living and the choices that I was making. Okay, the next really big puzzle piece for me in my journey to healing anxious attachment was that I learned about my nervous system and how to self-soothe. Now, I did not know any of this before I started out on this journey, and it was so groundbreaking, paradigm shifting, light bulb moment for me, a series of light bulb moments to learn about this. And this was stuff that I learned because my therapist was a somatic therapist, and also the training program to become a coach that I enrolled in was somatic in focus. And so I was really immersing myself in learning about the nervous system and how our stress responses and the states that we're in shape everything. They shape our perception, they shape our relationships and our experience of safety, and really understanding that until we can and create this experience of safety within us, that we are going to be driven by stress. And when we are driven by stress, we lose access to our empathy and our ability to reason and consider alternatives and all of the things that make us good at relationships. They leave the building, they go offline when we're stressed. And so if we are constantly in this state of stress and we're constantly perceiving threat and danger in our relationships, then our capacity to be in the mode that allows us to build healthy relationships is really offline, not available to us. And so learning about that and building out this whole toolkit of things that I could reach for to create safety within myself when I was triggered, rather than just riding the wave of the trigger and reacting and being really, frankly, when I was in that relationship, I would get triggered all the time and I would just lash out. I would fire off 10 text messages in a row that would just escalate and escalate in terms of trying to get engagement from my partner, because his stonewalling was so infuriating to me. And I would get so fired up and so angry and so indignant, in this sense of like injustice and how can you treat me like this? I would just keep amping up and amping up. And that's what my system did. And I started to understand what was going on there and what was happening in my body and how I could actually become the active operator of that, get into the driver's seat of that experience rather than just have it overtake me and drive me into more and more of that dysfunction. So I started to shift into more of, again, more agency around what was going on in my body. And now it's something that I feel, I rarely get triggered now, but when I do, it's not something that I'm afraid of because it doesn't take over my system. It's something that I have the ability to observe and choose how I'm going to respond. And I have so many tools that I can reach for at any given moment that allow me to bring safety back into my body and then to respond in a way that is mature and thoughtful and conducive to the kind of person I want to be and the kind of relationships that I want to be in. So learning about my nervous system was a game changer. Okay, another really key piece was that I learned to start validating myself rather than obsessing over trying to get my partner to do it. So I started to really believe that I wasn't asking for too much and that my experience was valid and that my needs were totally reasonable and that the things I was asking of him were not things that I should have had to fight tooth and nail over. And this is, the pattern that I was so deep in was I would be begging him to just answer my calls. It had gotten so far removed from reasonable reality, but because he would get so defensive and come up with all of these excuses and tell me that I was asking for too much or that I was being too demanding or whatever, or just explain away. He was so chronically invalidating of me that I got sucked into just trying to convince him and persuade him and get him to see things from my point of view, rather than just having my own back, validating myself and agreeing to disagree on that and deciding the relationship wasn't right for me, which is eventually where I got to, thank goodness. But that's the trap that I was in, feeling so invalidated by him, feeling so dismissed by him, feeling there was a lot of gaslighting and stuff that went on in that relationship. I don't use that term very lightly, but there was a lot of that, right? Just total denial of reality in a way where it felt so confusing that I just had to keep trying to get him to agree with me so that I didn't feel crazy. And I stopped playing that game and I just started going, I don't need you to agree with me, but here's what I'm looking for. Here's what I need. I'm not going to fight with you over the bare minimum anymore. And as soon as I stopped playing that game and stopped being sucked into the whirlpool of it, it became much clearer to me that we were just not compatible and that was okay. And I was okay with us just not being compatible. It felt very freeing as soon as I was able to start validating myself and my needs and my boundaries and my requests as being valid and reasonable rather than needing him to do that in order for me to believe it. So that was a really big piece as well. I learned about boundaries and I practiced setting them. So this is kind of related to what I was just talking about. But as it happened, I didn't know what a boundary was really. I'd heard the term, but it was only through therapy and through doing a lot of this work that I really started to appreciate how completely absent that concept was in my own life. I had such a streak of rescuing people and feeling like I was responsible for making everyone happy. And if there was a crisis, like I would swoop in and save the day. And I think in large part that was about my own need to be the helper and to be that rescuer, but also also because I felt like it was my responsibility to do that. And that's just what you do when the people that you love are in need. You go in guns blazing and have this full blown crisis response. But I also started to see through therapy what that was costing me to feel responsible for taking care of everyone all the time. And it's not to say that I've swung to the other extreme of not being helpful, but I've stopped feeling like I have to do that as part of my job. And I'm so glad that I did that boundary work in the lead up to leaving the relationship, because after I had left, there was a period where my ex was calling me a lot and apologizing profusely and begging me to take him back and all of these things. And had I not done that work, I think I would have felt really guilty and I would have felt obliged to fix that or to sideline my own inner knowing that I had done the right thing by leaving to make it okay for him and to make him feel better. And having done that work, I was able to say, I'm really sorry, but this is my decision and it's not going to change. So being clear in my own boundaries, being clear in my own worth there and holding firm on what I knew was right for me. And that's what that boundary work allowed me to do and got me to that point where I felt comfortable doing that. Even though it was edgy, I didn't wobble, I didn't falter on the boundaries that I knew I had to set. Okay, and the last really key thing that I did in this journey of overcoming anxious attachment was I created a really clear vision for my life and my relationships in terms of what I wanted and what I was available for, and really up leveled in terms of what I thought was possible. As I said, I was in this version of my life that was so cloistered and small and constrained by the job that I was in, the relationship that I was in. Again, I don't use this word very much, but like I was settling big time. I was really putting a lid on what I truly wanted because it just felt so far away from my reality and I didn't really know how to get from, it felt like going from A to Z, and there was a whole bunch of stuff in between that I couldn't even really contemplate, and I was so stressed all the time that it just felt too hard. And so once I started to do all of these other things, it opened up this possibility of like, how good could it be? And am I going to be courageous enough to take steps towards something so much bigger and more wonderful than what I've been living? And reckoning with the fact that might mean letting go of a lot of the things that are familiar about my current life. It lit up such a fire within me that I was okay with that loss. I was okay with the letting go of things that were no longer really in alignment for me, and believing that I could create a business and I could have freedom in my time and that I could really have a deep sense of love and respect for myself, that I could have a life that was characterized by joy and pleasure and ease rather than stress and frustration and anxiety. Having all of those things, that I could have a relationship that really felt like a resting place and a partnership where we were growing together and we had the same vision, and all of those things. I dared to dream on all of that. That sounds so cliche and so cringe, but that's really true. I went through this whole period of metamorphosis where like I went all in on the vision and I held that vision and I really took steps towards it. I almost proceeded on the basis that I actually wasn't interested in anything less than that. So I really radically up-leveled the standards for myself, for what I was available for. And I think part of what allowed me to do that was feeling more comfortable within myself, and that, I wasn't trying to fill a void as I had been previously. I wasn't just trying to grab onto anyone who would pay attention to me so that I could feel better about myself. I had started to feel better about myself from within. And all of a sudden, it opened up possibilities of what life could be for me. And gosh, I am so grateful to that former version of myself for doing that work, because here I sit, having built a business that has helped thousands of people through my programs and my coaching practice. I have a podcast that has reached millions of people around the world, and I get to do work every day that truly lights me up and makes me feel grateful deep in my soul. And I really feel like I'm doing something meaningful with my life. And I have a beautiful relationship not a perfect relationship, nobody does, but I have a beautiful relationship with a partner who I love and respect and admire, and who loves and respects and admires me. We have a beautiful son together. Life feels really magical. And I just want to emphasize that not that long ago, that felt like a distant dream. In fact, it was so far removed from reality that I couldn't have even dreamt it. So I share this hoping that it sparks something in you the same way that I experienced that spark, that inner knowing, that little nudge or that little voice when I was at the start of my journey that said, there's got to be more than this. It can't be this for the rest of my life. And I really hope that you feel inspired and that you believe me when I say that your anxious attachment, the things that you've struggled with in relationships up until now, it's not a life sentence. It doesn't have to be this way. You can learn and grow and evolve and create a life that is so much more wonderful and magical and freeing and easeful than maybe feels possible right now. But if I can do it, the thousands of other people that I've worked with can do it, so can you. So I really hope that this is helpful. And of course, if you would like some extra support on this and you would like to invest in yourself through my tried and tested framework, my Healing Anxious Attachment course is very comprehensive. It distills down everything that I learned in my own journey and in guiding so many thousands of others through the journey as well, into a very thorough but digestible framework for healing that will keep you accountable and that will allow you to not only develop so much more knowledge and awareness around what got you here, but also give you the tools to get you to that next stage and to support you on your path to healing. So if you would like to take that next step, I would love to see you in my Healing Anxious Attachment program as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. As I said, I so hope that this has given you some inspiration, that it has lit that little fire or that spark in you. And I'm sending you so much love as you venture down this path of healing. Thanks for joining me for this episode of On Attachment. If you want to go deeper on all things attachment, love, and relationships, you can find me on Instagram at Stephanie__Rig or at stephanierig.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd be so grateful if you could leave a review and a 5-star rating. It really does help so much. Thanks again for being here, and I hope to see you again soon.